the morning of October 25, 1944. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stands on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, somewhere in the Philippine Sea, watching American aircraft swarm the horizon like locusts. His fleet, the most powerful surface force Japan has assembled in over a year, is under relentless attack. Wave after wave of Grumman Hellcats and Avenger torpedo bombers peel off from carriers. His intelligence officers assured him shouldn't exist. Not here, not in these numbers. 3 hours earlier, Kurita had received an intelligence briefing that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Americans, his staff reported, had deployed 15 Essex-class fleet carriers to the Pacific Theater, 15 massive ships, each capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft, each representing a level of industrial output that seemed to defy the laws of economics and physics. For a man who had spent his entire career in the Imperial Japanese Navy, this number represented something far worse than a tactical problem. It represented the complete invalidation of everything Japan's naval war plan had been built upon. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Kurita couldn't have known, what no Japanese commander could have comprehended in that moment, was that this figure of 15 carriers wasn't the ceiling of American production. It was barely the beginning. In the shipyards of Newport News, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and Quincy, 9 more Essex-class carriers were already taking shape. Within 8 months, every single one of them would be commissioned and operational. The United States was about to demonstrate an industrial capacity so overwhelming that it would shatter not just Japan's naval strategy, but the entire philosophical foundation upon which the empire had gone to war. This is the story of that realization, not the story of a single battle or a dramatic turning point, but the slow, grinding psychological destruction of watching an enemy produce warships faster than you could sink them. It's the story of admirals trained to believe that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, confronted with mathematics so brutal that no amount of courage could answer it. And it begins not in 1944, but 3 years earlier, when Japan's naval leadership made calculations that would prove catastrophically wrong. December the 7th, 1941. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor, he did so with no illusions about Japan's long-term prospects in a war with the United States. Yamamoto had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and traveled extensively across the American industrial heartland. Unlike many of his colleagues in the Naval General Staff, he understood exactly what Japan was challenging. "I shall run wild for 6 months or a year," he reportedly told Prime Minister Konoe, "but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." The strategy behind Pearl Harbor was never about conquering America. It was about buying time. The plan was elegantly simple in concept. Destroy the American Pacific Fleet in a single devastating blow, then rapidly seize a defensive perimeter across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. By the time America rebuilt its naval forces, Japan would be so deeply entrenched in fortified island positions that the cost of dislodging them would be prohibitive. America, facing casualties in the hundreds of thousands for what amounted to colonial possessions on the far side of the world, would negotiate a settlement recognizing Japan's greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The entire strategy rested on a single critical assumption: that American industrial production, while vast, could not be mobilized quickly enough to overwhelm Japan's initial advantages in trained pilots, battle-hardened crews, and strategically positioned bases. Japanese naval planners had studied American shipbuilding capacity. They knew the Americans could build ships. What they fundamentally misunderstood was the scale and speed at which American industry could transform from peacetime production to total war mobilization. In 1941, The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed 10 aircraft carriers of all types. The United States had 7. Japan's newest fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were formidable ships, each displacing nearly 30,000 tons and carrying over 70 aircraft. The Americans' newest carrier, Hornet, commissioned in October 1941, was comparable in capability. On paper, the naval balance wasn't absurdly lopsided. Japan had superiority in trained naval aviators, superior torpedo technology, and the advantage of interior lines in the Pacific. The surprise attack at Pearl Harbor would eliminate American battleship superiority in one stroke. What Japanese planners failed to grasp was that American industrial capacity wasn't just larger than Japan's. It existed in an entirely different category of economic organization. In 1941, the United States produced more steel than Japan, Germany, and Italy combined. American automobile plants alone, facilities that could be converted to aircraft or tank production, exceeded the total industrial output of the entire Japanese empire. The American labor force was not just bigger, it was supported by infrastructure, mechanization, and organizational systems that allowed productivity per worker that Japanese industry couldn't approach. But raw numbers meant nothing if they couldn't be mobilized, organized, and deployed. And in the first 6 months of the Pacific War, it appeared that Yamamoto's gamble might actually work. The attack on Pearl Harbor sank or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed 188 aircraft, and killed 2,403 servicemen. The American Pacific Fleet was crippled. In the months that followed, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with a speed that shocked even their own commanders. Wake Island fell on December 23rd. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. Manila fell on January 2nd, 1942. Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress, surrendered on February 15th, with 85,000 Commonwealth troops marching into captivity in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. By May 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the waters north of Australia. They had seized the Dutch East Indies oil fields, Malaya's rubber plantations, and Burma's rice paddies. The defensive perimeter was in place. The greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was a reality, and America's carriers, the few that remained, were scattered, cautious, unable to challenge Japanese dominance. In Tokyo, there was cautious optimism. The Americans would come eventually, yes, they would build new ships. But building ships took time, training crews took longer, and every month that passed gave Japan more time to fortify their island strongholds, to dig in their coastal artillery, to make every potential American objective so costly in blood that, eventually, surely, the American public would demand their government seek terms. This assessment wasn't entirely unreasonable. Wars are not won by industrial capacity alone. They're won by will, by the ability to sustain casualties and continue fighting. The Japanese military culture, built on centuries of samurai tradition and filtered through 20th century ultranationalism, genuinely believed that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage. The idea wasn't absurd on its face. Guerrilla forces throughout history have defeated larger, better-equipped enemies through sheer determination. Japan's plan was to make the Pacific into a war of attrition so brutal that American democracy, with its free press and electoral accountability, would flinch. What they didn't account for was that American industrial mobilization wasn't going to take years. It was already happening. In June 1942, the United States Navy awarded a contract to Newport News Shipbuilding for a new class of fleet carrier. The Essex-class design had been in development since 1939, But Pearl Harbor transformed it from a peacetime construction program into a national emergency. The specifications were ambitious: 872 feet long, displacing 27,000 tons, capable of operating 90 to 100 aircraft, with a top speed of 33 knots. These weren't going to be stopgap vessels or converted hulls. They were going to be purpose-built fleet carriers, optimized for the kind of naval warfare the Pacific demanded. The keel of the first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex herself, had been laid down in April 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor. When war came, construction accelerated dramatically. Newport News shipbuilding went to round-the-clock shifts. Steel that would have gone to commercial construction was diverted to military contracts. Welding techniques that had been considered experimental became standard practice, dramatically reducing construction time. The compartmentalized construction methods pioneered in American shipyards, building entire sections of the ship simultaneously in different parts of the yard, then assembling them like pieces of a puzzle, allowed a pace of construction that traditional methods couldn't approach. Essex was commissioned on December 31st, 1942, just 20 months after her keel was laid. By the standards of naval construction, this was extraordinary. The Japanese carrier Taiho, laid down in July 1941, wouldn't be commissioned until March 1944, 32 months of construction. The Americans were building fleet carriers in 2/3 the time it took Japan to build one, and Essex wasn't alone. USS Yorktown, named for the carrier sunk at Midway, was commissioned in April 1943. USS Intrepid followed in August, USS Hornet in November. USS Lexington, named for the carrier lost at Coral Sea, joined the fleet in February 1944. By spring 1944, 7 Essex-class carriers were operational in the Pacific. By summer, that number had grown to 10. Japanese naval intelligence watched this buildup with growing alarm. Each new carrier represented not just additional American combat power, but evidence of an industrial system operating at a scale Japan couldn't match. When the Shokaku-class carriers were designed in the late 1930s, Japanese naval architects had calculated that Japan's shipyards could produce perhaps 1 fleet carrier per year under wartime conditions. The Americans were commissioning 1 every 6 to 8 weeks. But the intelligence reports coming across Japanese admirals' desks in 1944 weren't just tracking hulls in the water. They were tracking hulls under construction, and the numbers were getting worse. By October 1944, when Vice Admiral Kurita received his briefing about 15 Essex-class carriers, Japanese intelligence had identified every major warship under construction in American yards. They knew about the additional Essex-class hulls on the ways. They knew about the light carriers being mass-produced on converted cruiser hulls. They knew about the escort carriers being stamped out of Kaiser's yards like automobiles on an assembly line. What they couldn't quite grasp was the timeline. How fast were these ships being finished? How many were already in the final stages of fitting out? How many more were about to join the onslaught? The she's answer would become clear soon enough. Between October 1944 and June 1945, a span of just 8 months, 9 more Essex-class carriers would join the fleet. USS Hancock in April, USS Bennington in August, USS Boxer in April, USS Bonhomme Richard in November, USS Antietam in January 1945, USS Shangri-La in September 44, USS Lake Champlain in June 45. USS Tarawa and USS Kearsarge would follow before war's end. But these raw numbers don't capture the psychological impact of what Japanese commanders were witnessing. It wasn't just that America was building carriers faster than Japan could sink them, though that was certainly true. It was that the rate of American production was accelerating even as Japan's industrial capacity was collapsing. Consider the mathematics from a Japanese perspective. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These ships represented years of construction, thousands of skilled workers, and resources Japan could barely afford to expend even in peacetime. They were irreplaceable. In the 2 years following Midway, Japan would commission exactly 1 fleet carrier, Taiho, before she was sunk by an American submarine 3 months after entering service. Japan's total carrier construction for the entire war would amount to approximately 15 ships of all types, including light carriers and converted vessels. In that same period, the United States commissioned over 100 carriers of all types. The Essex-class alone would eventually number 24 ships. The Independence-class light carriers added 9 more. The escort carriers, small, slow vessels built on merchant hulls, but still capable of operating aircraft, would number over 70 by war's end. Kaiser Shipbuilding's Vancouver yard was producing 1 escort carrier every 7 days at peak production. 7 days. Japan needed 2 to 3 years to build a fleet carrier. America was producing smaller carriers in a week. This wasn't a difference in degree, it was a difference in kind. It represented an industrial capacity so vast that it fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare. 4 centuries, warships had been precious, irreplaceable assets. Losing a major capital ship was a strategic disaster that might take years to recover from. In the Pacific War, America was building fleet carriers faster than Japan could train the pilots to attack them, and the Japanese High Command knew it. They had the intelligence, they had the photographs, they had spies and attachés and reconnaissance aircraft documenting the endless rows of ships taking shape in American yards. What they didn't have was any answer to it. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, known to American aviators as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, provided a brutal demonstration of what this industrial disparity meant in practice. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet represented virtually everything Japan had left. 5 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, 5 battleships, 11 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 28 destroyers. The Americans met them with Task Force 58, 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 7 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 13 light cruisers, and 69 destroyers. In raw numbers, the forces weren't absurdly mismatched, but every single American carrier was new. Most had been commissioned within the previous 18 months. Their aircraft were the latest models, F-6F Hellcats, that outperformed the vaunted Zero, TBF Avengers with radar and modern torpedoes. Their pilots had been trained in the vast infrastructure of American naval aviation schools, with fuel to spare for hundreds of practice hours. Their radar systems could detect incoming attacks from over 100 miles away. The Japanese force included carriers that had been in continuous combat operations since Pearl Harbor. Their aircraft were increasingly obsolete. Their pilots, the ones who'd survived 3 years of attrition, were exhausted. Their newest pilots had received perhaps a third of the training hours their predecessors had gotten, because Japan simply didn't have the aviation fuel to spare for extended training. Their radar was inferior to American systems, their damage control procedures less developed, their supply situation desperate. The battle lasted 2 days. Japan lost 3 fleet carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hiyo. Over 400 aircraft were shot down, along with the majority of their trained air crews. American losses, 123 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents and minimal damage to ships. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter, and it demonstrated conclusively that Japan's strategy of trading space for time had failed. Time hadn't worked in Japan's favor. Every month that passed gave America more ships, more planes, more trained crews. Every month weakened Japan's ability to resist. After the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force effectively ceased to exist as a strategic weapon. The remaining carriers would serve as decoys, sacrificial pawns meant to draw American attention, while surface forces attempted desperate attacks. The age of Japanese naval aviation, which had begun so dramatically at Pearl Harbor, was over. And still the American carriers kept coming. By October 1944, when Kurita received that briefing about 15 Essex carriers, the operational reality was even worse than the raw count suggested. Each of those American carriers represented not just a ship, but an entire integrated combat system. They operated with destroyer escorts built in the same massive numbers. They were supplied by fleet oilers and ammunition ships that allowed them to remain at sea for months. They were supported by submarines that had cut Japan's merchant marine to ribbons, by land-based aircraft, operating from newly captured island bases, by an intelligence network that had broken Japan's naval codes. The Americans weren't just building carriers. They were building an entire naval industrial ecosystem designed to project power across 8,000 miles of ocean and sustain it indefinitely. Japan's carriers, even when they'd been operational, had always struggled with logistics. They couldn't remain at sea as long as American carriers. Their damage control was inferior. Their replacement pilot pipeline was a fraction of American capacity. Even if Japan could have matched American carrier production, which was impossible, they couldn't have matched the infrastructure that made those carriers effective. Standing on Yamato's bridge that October morning, watching American aircraft fill the sky, Kurita understood what many Japanese officers were beginning to realize. The war wasn't lost because of any single battle or tactical failure. It was lost because Japan had challenged an enemy whose industrial capacity existed in a different category of magnitude. An enemy that could absorb the losses of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway, and emerge stronger 18 months later. An enemy that built ships faster than they could be sunk and trained pilots faster than they could be killed. The 15 carriers Kurita knew about represented the visible evidence of American power. The 9 more under construction, ready to join the fleet within months, represented something more terrifying. Proof that American production wasn't slowing down, wasn't approaching its limits, wasn't going to stop until Japan's military capacity was completely annihilated. This realization that Japan had not merely underestimated American industrial capacity, but had failed to comprehend it even existed on this scale, would become the defining psychological trauma of Japan's naval leadership in the war's final year. They had gone to war believing that courage, training, and tactical excellence could compensate for material disadvantage. They were learning, battle by battle, carrier by carrier, that mathematics didn't care about fighting spirit. The strategic situation facing Japan's naval command in late 1944 was unprecedented in modern warfare. Never before had a major power watched in real time as an opponent's industrial production rendered their own military forces obsolete not through superior tactics or brilliant generalship, but through sheer quantitative output. The intelligence briefings arriving at Imperial General Headquarters painted a picture so bleak that some officers initially refused to believe the numbers were accurate. Captain Atsushi Oi, serving on the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, later described the atmosphere in those final months of 1944. "We knew the Americans were building carriers," he wrote in his post-war memoir. "What we didn't understand was that they had fundamentally changed the nature of industrial production. They weren't building ships the way we built ships, one at a time, carefully, with craftsmanship. They were manufacturing them like automobiles. We were still thinking in terms of naval construction. They were thinking in terms of mass production. This distinction was crucial. Japanese shipyards, even at peak wartime production, operated on traditional principles. Skilled workers laid keels, assembled frames, installed engines and systems through methods that hadn't changed fundamentally in decades. Quality control was meticulous. Each ship was treated as a unique construction project. This approach produced excellent vessels, but it was slow. The Yamato-class battleships, the largest and most powerful battleships ever built, required nearly 3 years from keel laying to commissioning. Every component was custom-fitted. Every system was hand-assembled. American shipyards had revolutionized this process. Henry Kaiser's methods, developed in building Liberty ships, had been adapted to carrier construction. Prefabricated sections were built in workshops away from the shipways, then moved into place by massive cranes. Welding replaced riveting wherever possible, dramatically reducing assembly time. Standardized components meant that parts could be manufactured at multiple facilities and assembled wherever needed. The Americans weren't just building faster, they'd fundamentally reimagined the entire process of naval construction. Newport News Shipbuilding, the primary Essex-class construction yard, had laid down USS Intrepid's keel in December 1941. She was commissioned in August 1943, 20 months later. USS Hancock, laid down in January 1943, was commissioned in April 1944, 15 months. The construction time was dropping with each hull as workers gained experience and processes were refined. By mid-1944, the yard was approaching a rhythm of commissioning one Essex-class carrier every 8 to 10 weeks. But the production numbers only told part of the story. What truly devastated Japanese strategic planning was the quality of these rapidly produced ships. There's a tendency to assume that faster construction must mean inferior products, but the Essex-class carriers were exceptional vessels. They were more heavily armored than their predecessors, with better subdivision to survive torpedo hits. Their aviation fuel systems incorporated lessons from earlier carriers lost to explosion and fire. Their radar and communications equipment represented the cutting edge of electronics technology. Their anti-aircraft batteries were formidable. In November 1944, USS Intrepid, one of the mass-produced Essex carriers, was hit by 2 kamikaze aircraft off the Philippines. The crashes killed 69 crew members and started serious fires. The ship's damage control parties had the fires under control within 2 hours. Intrepid withdrew from the combat zone, made temporary repairs, and was back in action within weeks. 2 months later, she was hit by another kamikaze. Again, damage control saved the ship. She returned to combat after brief repairs. Compare this to the Japanese carrier Taiho, which had taken 3 years to build with meticulous craftsmanship. In June 1944, she was hit by a single torpedo from the American submarine USS Albacore. The initial damage was relatively minor. 1 torpedo hit among a heavily armored ship. But volatile aviation fuel vapors spread through the ship's ventilation systems. 6 hours after the torpedo impact, a massive explosion tore Taiho apart. She sank with 1,600 crew members. 3 years of construction, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, destroyed by 1 torpedo and inadequate damage control. The Americans were building ships faster and making them more survivable. This combination was psychologically devastating to Japanese naval officers who had spent their entire careers in a culture that emphasized quality over quantity, spiritual strength over material advantage. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of Battleship Division I and later commander of the 5th Air Fleet, kept a detailed diary throughout the war. His entry for December 19, 1944, captures the growing despair. The enemy's material superiority is now so overwhelming that our forces are like insects attacking an elephant. Yet we are ordered to fight on. We calculate we need to destroy 30 enemy carriers to achieve our objectives. Intelligence reports 60 carriers now operational or nearing completion. The mathematics are impossible. 60 carriers. Ugaki's count included Essex-class fleet carriers, Independence-class light carriers, and the larger escort carriers capable of supporting amphibious operations. But even if his count was imprecise, the essential reality was accurate. The United States had more carriers in the Pacific in late 1944 than Japan had possessed in total at the start of the war, and more were arriving every month. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The human cost of this industrial disparity was becoming impossible to ignore. Japanese naval aviation, which had begun the war with perhaps the finest carrier pilots in the world, was being systematically destroyed not primarily through combat losses, though those were severe, but through the impossibility of replacement. Training a competent carrier pilot required time, fuel, and experienced instructors. By late 1944, Japan had none of these in adequate supply. American pilot training programs were producing approximately 10,000 naval aviators per year by 1944. Training bases stretched across the southern United States, where fuel was plentiful, weather was favorable, and airspace was unlimited. A typical American naval aviator received over 300 hours of flight training before being assigned to a carrier. They practiced navigation, gunnery, formation flying, carrier landings, and combat tactics until these skills became instinctive. Japanese pilot training had collapsed under the weight of fuel shortages and the loss of experienced instructors. By 1944, new pilots might receive 60 hours of flight training, less than a quarter of their American counterparts. Many had never practiced carrier landings before being assigned to operational squadrons. Some had barely 20 hours in the aircraft type they'd be flying in combat. They were being sent into battle against American pilots who'd been thoroughly trained, equipped with superior aircraft, and supported by radar direction from their carriers. The result was predictable. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese strike forces were intercepted far from the American carriers by radar-directed fighter patrols. Inexperienced Japanese pilots, flying in loose formations, were cut apart by Hellcat fighters. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft that participated in the attacks, 315 were shot down. Most never got close enough to the American carriers to even attempt an attack. The Americans lost 29 aircraft in air combat. This wasn't a battle between equal forces where one side got lucky. It was industrial warfare in its purest form. Superior equipment, better training, and overwhelming numbers, all enabled by an industrial base that could sustain losses and continue producing replacements indefinitely. The 9 additional Essex carriers that would join the fleet between October 1944 and June 1945 represented more than just additional hulls. Each carrier brought approximately 90 aircraft and 3,000 crew members. Together, those 9 ships would add roughly 810 aircraft and 27,000 trained personnel to the Pacific Fleet. The pilots operating from those carriers had received months of training. The mechanics maintaining the aircraft had been thoroughly schooled in their specialties. The damage control parties had practiced their procedures until they could respond to emergencies in darkness, in smoke, under attack. Japan, in that same 8-month period, would struggle to replace even a fraction of the aircraft and trained personnel it was losing. The shipyards that had built Japan's carriers were increasingly targeted by American bombing raids. Steel that might have gone to warship construction was being diverted to desperate attempts to build merchant ships to replace the hundreds being sunk by American submarines. Aluminum for aircraft was in desperately short supply. Aviation fuel was so scarce that new pilots sometimes trained in gliders. The strategic implications were inescapable. Even if Japan had possessed some wonder weapon, some tactical innovation that could sink American carriers efficiently, the mathematics didn't work. If Japan sank 2 American carriers per month, a rate that would have required impossible Japanese tactical superiority, the Americans would still be gaining carriers faster than they were losing them. The shipyards were producing them that quickly. This realization led directly to the kamikazes. When Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed organized suicide attacks in October 1944, it wasn't because Japanese leadership had suddenly embraced fanaticism. It was a rational response to impossible mathematics. If a conventional attack required dozens of aircraft to achieve a single hit on an American carrier, with most attacking aircraft being shot down before reaching their targets, then the cost-exchange ratio was unsustainable. But if pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into targets, the hit probability increased dramatically. 1 pilot, 1 plane, 1 bomb, delivered with absolute certainty, might be more effective than 10 conventional attacks. The kamikaze doctrine was an admission of defeat. It acknowledged that Japan could no longer train pilots capable of executing conventional attacks effectively, that Japanese aircraft could no longer survive long enough in American-controlled airspace to deliver weapons normally, that the only way to inflict meaningful damage was through suicide attacks that eliminated the need for pilot skill or aircraft survivability. And even the kamikazes couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Between October 1944 and war's end, kamikaze attacks would sink approximately 40 American vessels and damage hundreds more. But the vast majority of ships sunk were smaller vessels, destroyers, destroyer escorts, landing craft. Only a handful of carriers were sunk, and none were Essex-class fleet carriers. The big fleet carriers, the symbols of American industrial power, proved remarkably difficult to sink even with suicide attacks. USS Franklin was hit by 2 bombs in March 1945 while operating off Japan. The bombs detonated in her hangar deck, setting off massive fires and secondary explosions. Over 800 crew members were killed, the worst single-ship casualty toll in U.S. naval history. The ship was effectively destroyed as a combat unit, with her flight deck buckled and most of her internal spaces gutted by fire. She didn't sink. Damage control parties fought the fires for hours. The engineering crew kept the engines running. Franklin steamed 12,000 miles back to New York under her own power, listing, burnt, barely seaworthy, but afloat. She would survive the war. Japanese observers, monitoring American radio traffic and intelligence reports about the attack, couldn't comprehend how a ship that damaged could remain operational. It violated their understanding of naval warfare. The answer lay in design philosophy and damage control doctrine. American carriers were built with extensive subdivision, multiple redundant systems, and damage control procedures that had been refined through painful experience. Every American carrier lost early in the war. Lexington at Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, Hornet at Santa Cruz, Wasp to submarine attack, had provided lessons that were incorporated into later designs and procedures. The Essex-class carriers embodied those lessons. They were built to absorb punishment and survive. But beyond individual ship survivability, the industrial system behind them was even more resilient. When Franklin limped back to New York, she was immediately replaced in the task force rotation by another Essex carrier. There was no gap in combat capability. The Americans could afford to lose ships, not because individual vessels weren't valuable, but because the production pipeline was so robust that losses could be absorbed without degrading overall combat power. By early 1945, the strategic situation had become so hopeless that Japanese planning documents began using phrases like sacrificial attacks and honorable death rather than victory or defense. The remaining Japanese carriers, there were perhaps 4 still operational in any meaningful sense, were being reserved for a final suicide mission, Operation Tengo, which would send the entire surviving fleet on a one-way attack against American invasion forces at Okinawa. The plan was explicit about its impossibility. The ships wouldn't have enough fuel for a return voyage. They weren't expected to survive. The goal was simply to inflict maximum casualties on American forces before being destroyed, in hopes that the bloodshed would convince America to negotiate rather than invade the home islands. It was the naval equivalent of the kamikaze doctrine. Acknowledgement that conventional operations were impossible, that survival was impossible, that all that remained was choosing the manner of death. Operation Tengo was cancelled before it could be executed in its full form, though the battleship Yamato did sortie in April 1945 on what was essentially a suicide mission. She was sunk by carrier aircraft from Task Force 58, attacks launched from Essex-class carriers, flown by thoroughly trained American pilots, coordinated by radar and radio in a demonstration of the integrated combat system American industry had created. The 9 carriers that joined the fleet in those final months of the war participated in operations that Japanese forces could barely contest. USS Shangri-La, commissioned in September 1944, was conducting combat operations by early 1945. USS Boxer, commissioned in April 1945, was working up for deployment when the war ended. USS Lake Champlain set a speed record, transiting from the East Coast to the Pacific in record time, arriving in theater for the final months of combat operations. Each of these ships represented American industrial capacity that Japan simply couldn't match or counter. They weren't experimental vessels or desperate conversions. They were first-line fleet carriers, built to standardized specifications, crewed by trained personnel, equipped with modern aircraft and weapons. And behind them, the shipyards were still building more. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in August of 1945, citing a new and most cruel bomb as justification, the atomic weapons were indeed a factor. But the Imperial Japanese Navy's leadership knew the war had been lost long before Hiroshima. It had been lost in the shipyards of Newport News and Brooklyn and Philadelphia, in the training fields of Texas and Florida, in the industrial heartland of a nation that had transformed its entire economy into a machine for producing warships faster than they could possibly be sunk. The final reckoning came not in battle but in silence. When Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, Navy Minister in the final months of the war, was asked after the surrender what had defeated Japan, he didn't mention Midway or the Philippine Sea or the Kamikaze campaign. The war was decided, he said, when the Americans commissioned their 10th Essex carrier. Everything after that was just determining how long we could continue before accepting the inevitable. The 10th Essex carrier was USS Lexington, commissioned in February 1944. By Yonai's calculation, Japan's defeat was sealed more than a year before the atomic bombs fell, more than 18 months before the surrender. The remainder of the war, from this perspective, was simply Japan's military and civilian population paying the price for a strategic miscalculation made in Tokyo in 1941. That miscalculation hadn't been about American will or fighting spirit. Japanese planners had understood that America was soft by Japanese standards, that democracy made populations averse to casualties, that a war across 8,000 miles of ocean would test American resolve. What they'd miscalculated was American industrial capacity, not just its absolute size, but its flexibility, its efficiency, and the speed with which it could be mobilized for total war production. Vice Admiral Kurita survived the war. In post-war interrogations, he was asked repeatedly about his decision to retreat at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when his surface force had been on the verge of reaching the vulnerable American landing beaches. His answers were often contradictory, sometimes defensive, but in one session he provided what might have been his most honest assessment. I saw the American carriers. Every direction I looked, there were more carriers. My intelligence officers told me there were 15 in the theater. I believed I was facing at least 20. How do you fight an enemy that has 20 fleet carriers when your own nation has none? How do you plan for an enemy whose shipyards produce more carriers in 6 months than your entire navy possessed at the start of the war? His estimates were wrong. He wasn't facing 20 carriers at Leyte Gulf, but his fundamental point was valid. By late 1944, the visible evidence of American naval power had exceeded the theoretical calculations Japanese planners had made before the war. Those calculations had assumed American industrial production would take years to reach its full potential, that training programs would be slow to expand, that the inherent inefficiencies of democracy would hamper mobilization. Every assumption had proven false. The post-war analysis conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey included extensive interviews with Japanese military and civilian officials. One section focused specifically on the psychological impact of American industrial production on Japanese strategic thinking. Captain Toshikazu Ohmai, who served on the Naval General Staff throughout the war, provided insight into the progressive disillusionment. In 1942, we believed we were fighting a rich but decadent enemy that lacked fighting spirit. By 1943, we understood they had fighting spirit but believed our superior training and tactics could compensate for their material advantages. By 1944, we recognized their training and tactics were becoming equal to ours, but we still believed in the superiority of Japanese spiritual strength. By 1945, we understood that no amount of spiritual strength could overcome the material disparity, but by then it was far too late. This progressive recognition, the slow psychological adjustment to an impossible reality, was perhaps the true story of Japan's naval war. It wasn't a single catastrophic defeat, but a grinding realization that every month the war continued, the disparity grew worse. Every carrier Japan lost was irreplaceable. Every carrier America lost was replaced within months, often by a better ship with a more experienced crew. The final accounting of Essex-class carrier production tells the story in numbers that Japanese planners could never have imagined in 1941. The class eventually totaled 24 ships. Construction time decreased from the first hull to the last as efficiency improved. The total tonnage of the Essex-class exceeded the total tonnage of all Japanese carriers built during the entire war. The number of aircraft these carriers could deploy at any given moment exceeded the entire front-line strength of the Japanese Naval Air Force by 1945, and the Essexes were just part of American carrier production. The Independence-class light carriers added 9 more ships. The escort carriers, over 70 vessels ranging from the Casablanca class to the larger Commencement Bay class, provided air support for amphibious operations, anti-submarine patrols, and transport of aircraft. In total, American shipyards produced over 100 carriers of all types during the war years. Japan produced 15. These numbers represented more than industrial capacity. They represented a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached modern warfare. Japan's military culture, rooted in centuries of samurai tradition, emphasized individual excellence, spiritual strength, and the decisive battle. The ideal was the perfectly trained warrior whose skill and dedication could overcome any obstacle. This philosophy worked in an era when wars were decided by relatively small forces of professional soldiers. It was catastrophically inadequate for industrial warfare. The United States approached warfare as an engineering problem. How many ships do we need? How quickly can we build them? How do we train crews at scale? How do we create logistics systems that can support forces 8,000 miles from home? The American military culture wasn't built on warrior tradition, but on organizational efficiency, mass production, and systematic problem solving. It was the difference between craftsmanship and manufacturing, between the artisan and the assembly line. Neither approach was inherently superior in all contexts. Japanese emphasis on training and dedication had produced extraordinary results in the war's early months, but in a prolonged industrial conflict, the American approach was devastating. You couldn't outspirit an enemy that could replace losses faster than you could inflict them. The human cost of this strategic failure was immense. The Imperial Japanese Navy began the war with approximately 300,000 personnel. By war's end, approximately 380,000 Japanese sailors and naval aviators had been killed. The submarine force was virtually annihilated. 54 of 63 submarines lost. The carrier force was destroyed completely. Of the 10 carriers Japan possessed in December 1941, all were sunk. Of the new carriers built during the war, all but 1 or 2 training vessels were also sunk. American naval casualties, while significant, were proportionally far lower. The U.S. Navy lost approximately 62,000 killed during the entire war, across all theaters. This wasn't because American forces avoided combat, but because their ships were more survivable, their medical care was superior, and their overall force structure allowed them to prosecute the war without requiring suicidal tactics. The strategic lesson, that industrial capacity is decisive in modern warfare, was not new. The American Civil War had demonstrated it 80 years earlier, when the industrialized North ground down the more tactically proficient but industrially inferior South. World War I had reinforced it, when Germany's tactical excellence couldn't overcome the combined industrial weight of France, Britain, and eventually the United States. But each generation seems to need to relearn this lesson at tremendous cost. Japan's naval leadership learned it watching American carriers fill the Pacific, knowing each one represented industrial output they couldn't match, couldn't sink fast enough to matter, couldn't overcome through superior tactics or fighting spirit. They learned it in the silence between intelligence briefings, when the count went from 15 Essex carriers to 16 to 17, when the projections showed no end to American production, while Japan's own shipyards were running out of steel. Admiral Yonai's assessment that the war was decided when the 10th Essex carrier commissioned wasn't just a statement about naval balance. It was recognition that by that point the trajectory was irreversible. American production was accelerating while Japanese capacity was degrading. The gap would only widen. No tactical brilliance, no operational innovation, no amount of courage or dedication could close it. The 9 carriers that joined the fleet in the 8 months after Kurita's briefing were, in this sense, unnecessary. They didn't change the outcome. That had already been decided. But they did change the timeline. Each additional carrier shortened the war, reduced the number of desperate last stands Japanese forces could mount, accelerated the inevitable conclusion. When the war ended in August 1945, many of the Essex carriers had barely entered service. USS Antietam, commissioned in January 1945 and saw only limited combat. USS Princeton, the second ship to bear that name after the original was sunk in October 1944, commissioned in November 1945, too late to participate in combat operations. USS Valley Forge, commissioned in November 1946. The production pipeline was so robust that ships were still being completed after the war ended. This surplus capacity, the ability to continue producing warships even after achieving overwhelming superiority, was perhaps the most telling demonstration of American industrial power. Japan had strained every resource to build 15 carriers over 4 years of total war mobilization. America had built that many Essex-class carriers by mid-1944 and was still accelerating production, not because strategic necessity demanded it, but because the industrial infrastructure was in place and stopping it would have been more disruptive than continuing. In the decades after the war, many Essex-class carriers continued in service. They were modernized repeatedly, their straight decks modified for angled deck operations, their propulsion systems upgraded, their electronics replaced with modern systems. USS Lexington served until 1991, 47 years of commissioned service. The class participated in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Cold War deterrence operations, and served as training carriers for generations of American naval aviators. The ships outlasted the empire they'd been built to defeat by nearly half a century. That longevity, combined with their rapid production, embodied the strategic reality of industrial warfare. Japan had built beautiful ships, trained superb crews, fought with extraordinary courage, but they'd challenged an industrial system that could outproduce them 20-1, and no amount of tactical excellence could overcome that disparity. The final irony is that Japanese naval officers understood this before the war began. Yamamoto had warned that Japan couldn't win a prolonged conflict with the United States. Multiple staff studies had concluded that Japanese industrial capacity couldn't sustain a war lasting more than 2 years. The strategic plan had always required a short war, a negotiated settlement, American acceptance of Japan's regional sphere. When that gamble failed at Midway, when America refused to negotiate after early defeats, everything that followed was inevitable. Watching those 15 carriers in October 1944, knowing 9 more were coming, Vice Admiral Kurita was seeing the physical manifestation of that inevitability. Those ships represented decisions made in Washington and Detroit and Pittsburgh in 1941 and 42. Decisions to mobilize American industrial capacity completely, to build ships and aircraft faster than they could conceivably be sunk, to overwhelm Japan not through tactical brilliance but through sheer quantitative output. It was warfare reduced to mathematics, and the mathematics were merciless. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.